Right now, something deeply unsettling is happening in Washington, and most people haven't realized how close it is to reshaping global power. This isn't just another political disagreement, and it's definitely not just another Trump headline. What we're watching is the quiet collapse of authority inside the Republican Party, exposed by a single shocking moment when the Speaker of the House publicly distanced himself from Donald Trump. Not over taxes, not over elections, but over the possibility of military action tied to Greenland. That one hesitation revealed a truth far bigger than any speech or press conference. The power structure holding this movement together is cracking in real time. Because when the Speaker of the House can't fully back the president of his own party, it means control is slipping, fear is fading, and loyalty is no longer guaranteed. Behind closed doors, Republicans are counting votes they no longer have, alliances they can no longer trust, and consequences they can no longer avoid. And while this is happening, Trump's rhetoric is escalating outward toward territory, toward confrontation, toward global instability, at the exact moment his grip at home is weakening. This is where the story turns dangerous, because history shows us that when leaders lose control internally, they often look outward for dominance. And suddenly, what once sounded like a joke or a distraction starts to feel like a warning. Greenland is no longer just a headline. It's a symbol of how fragile American power has become, how exposed political leadership really is, and how close the system is to making decisions it cannot undo. Tonight, we're breaking down what Mike Johnson's hesitation really means, why Trump's fixation is more serious than it appears, how internal Republican fractures are driving external aggression, and why this moment could redefine America's role in the world. Because once you see what's actually happening behind the scenes, you won't be able to unsee it. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this isn't about Greenland at all. It's about power, survival, and a system pushing itself to the edge. Right now, before anyone has had time to slow down or even fully process what was said, Washington feels like a room where the lights have gone out and people are still moving on instinct, bumping into furniture they swear was never there before. Because what we are witnessing is not a single comment, not a single policy dispute, but the quiet sound of authority cracking under pressure. And it begins with a moment that on the surface looks small, almost technical, but in reality exposes the raw nerves of American power in 2025. The Speaker of the House publicly stepping away from the president of his own party on the subject of Greenland of all places, and doing it not because he wants to, but because he has no other choice left. To understand why this moment matters, you have to picture the political terrain Mike Johnson is standing on right now, because it is not solid ground, it is ice, and it is thinning by the hour. Johnson's speakership was never built on broad consensus or deep loyalty. It was built on a fragile equation where Donald Trump's influence over the Republican caucus provided the gravity that kept everyone in line. As long as Trump could snap his fingers and deliver votes, Johnson could pretend he had a mandate. But that gravity is weakening, and the signs are everywhere. A House majority that once existed on paper has collapsed into something that barely exists in reality. One Republican member has died. Another is hospitalized. Marjorie Taylor Greene, a figure who once embodied the loud, aggressive certainty of MAGA politics, has resigned. Suddenly, Johnson is counting heads every morning like a general waking up to discover his army shrank overnight. In that environment, every public statement becomes a survival test. When reporters pressed Johnson about Greenland, they weren't asking an abstract foreign policy question. They were forcing him to choose which fracture line he was willing to widen. On one side was Trump escalating rhetoric about territorial control, military options, and even the possibility of abandoning NATO if it stood in the way. On the other side were Johnson's own members, many of whom represent swing districts, exhausted donors and voters who did not sign up for a geopolitical crisis over Arctic territory. Johnson hesitated, deflected, and ultimately distanced himself. And that hesitation told us everything we needed to know. This was not leadership. This was damage control by a man who knows he is one misstep away from losing the gavel. But the Greenland story does not exist in isolation, and treating it as a sideshow is exactly how democracies get blindsided by history. That is why what Senator Chris Murphy said reframes this entire moment. Murphy did not dismiss Greenland as a distraction, even though it conveniently pulls attention away from other controversies like the Epstein documents. Instead, he laid out a chain reaction that should make anyone who cares about global stability stop scrolling and start paying attention. Greenland is not just land and ice. It is a keystone in the U.S.-European alliance structure. Any serious attempt to seize it by force would not merely strain NATO. It would effectively end it, detonating decades of coordinated defense policy in a single reckless move. Murphy's warning cuts deeper when you consider the broader strategic picture. The United States cannot realistically confront the rise of China alone. Every serious long-term strategy assumes coordination with Europe, shared intelligence, shared defense planning, and shared economic pressure. Break that alliance and you don't weaken China. You hand it the most valuable gift imaginable, a fractured West too busy fighting itself to maintain global leadership. In that context, the very idea of military action in Greenland stops being a bizarre headline and starts looking like an earthquake trigger. And yet here we are in January 2025, seriously asking whether the President of the United States might deploy military force against Greenland. That sentence alone should make people pause because it signals how far the political conversation has drifted from any recognizable center. This is not a new obsession. Trump floated the idea during his first term, and back then, when the political winds were still somewhat favorable, the pushback was strong enough to force a retreat. The now infamous visit involving J.D. Vance and his wife, which ended in diplomatic embarrassment when local officials refused to meet with them, was not a fluke. It was a warning sign that this fixation was already rubbing allies the wrong way. What has changed is not Trump's interest in Greenland, but the context around it. Trump is now operating in a political environment where his internal polling is flashing red. The coalition he believed was unbreakable is visibly splintering. Republicans are resigning. Others are openly defying him. Figures like Thomas Massie are no longer whispering dissent. They are broadcasting it. Don Bacon is threatening to walk away entirely. The aura of inevitability that once surrounded Trump's grip on the party is fading. And history tells us that when authoritarian-leaning leaders feel domestic power slipping, they often look outward for ways to reassert dominance. That is the lens through which this Greenland rhetoric must be viewed. It is not about minerals, shipping lanes, or even Russia, despite the constant invocation of national security. It is about manufacturing a crisis big enough to reorder the political landscape, to drown out internal weakness with external confrontation. This instinct is not unique to Trump, but what makes it particularly dangerous in this moment is the question of who is actually driving these decisions. As Trump shows increasing signs of cognitive decline, the focus shifts to the figures around him, especially Stephen Miller, who has emerged as a central force shaping aggressive policy positions. Miller's influence is not subtle. He is reportedly overseeing aspects of Venezuela policy alongside Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth. But time and again, it is Miller who pushes hardest for military intervention. Rubio's recent statements, which triggered Johnson's defensive posture, are revealing not just for what they say, but for how they say it. The administration's framing of military action has become increasingly contradictory. Trump has claimed that Congress has no authority over certain operations because they are classified as law enforcement actions rather than military interventions, a semantic maneuver designed to sidestep constitutional war powers. But that framing collapses under scrutiny. Sending troops into another territory, especially one tied directly to NATO, is not a law enforcement operation by any reasonable definition. It is military action, full stop. That is why senators like Ruben Galgo are introducing resolutions to block any such move without congressional authorization. And yet the rhetoric continues to escalate. Trump talks about boots on the ground. Allies amplify the message on social media. Television appearances hammer the same talking point. Greenland is vital to national security. The irony is impossible to ignore. Many of the same voices pushing this argument have opposed robust support for Ukraine, a country actively fighting Russian aggression. Consistency has never been the strong suit of this movement, but the contradiction underscores a deeper truth. These policies are not driven by coherent strategy, but by impulse and optics, and congressional Republicans know it. That is why the Greenland issue has become such a liability for them, and why Johnson's answers sound less like conviction and more like evasion. When Johnson bristles at what he calls go-to questions, he is not afraid of reporters. He is afraid of his own caucus. Right now, Republicans do not have a functional majority. With resignations, deaths, and hospitalizations, Johnson's margin for error is literally zero. One seat might be filled, another might flip. The math changes by the week. In that environment, every controversial stance risks triggering a chain reaction that could cost him the speakership and the party its prospects in the midterms. So when Johnson says flatly, "We're not at war with Greenland," it sounds obvious, even absurd, until you remember that the President of the United States has suggested he would abandon NATO to take it. Rubio has confirmed that all options remain on the table. The disconnect is stark. Which statement reflects reality? The answer, unsettlingly, is that both do, because the Republican Party is no longer operating from a unified set of principles. It is reacting, improvising, and contradicting itself in real time. This is the state of MAGA in 2025, a movement that once defined itself by opposition now finds itself in control of institutions it claimed to despise. Unsure how to wield power without exposing its own emptiness, Trump built his brand by attacking the so-called establishment, positioning himself as the outsider who would dismantle it. But after 2 terms with allies occupying the highest offices in government, that narrative collapses under its own weight. When you are the president and your ally is the speaker, you are the institution. That is the trap Mike Johnson is stuck in. He cannot run against the system when his party is running it. He cannot rail against elites while defending policies that serve oligarchs and oil executives. And he cannot fully embrace Trump's expansionist fantasies without risking political annihilation for a majority that barely exists. Every move he makes is toxic to someone, and that paralysis is visible in every hesitant answer, every deflection, every carefully worded sentence. Greenland, in this sense, is not just a foreign policy flashpoint. It is a mirror reflecting the internal collapse of Republican power. It shows a party that pursued power for its own sake, and now having achieved it, discovers that power without legitimacy, coherence, or public trust is brittle. Trump believes he can regain momentum through a new American imperialism, floating ideas about annexing Greenland, Panama, Cuba, Venezuela, as if the map itself were negotiable. But there is no strategy tying these impulses together, no clear benefit to ordinary Americans, and no plan for the consequences. America First was supposed to mean restraint, focus on domestic priorities, and end to endless entanglements. Instead, it has become a slogan flexible enough to justify almost anything, including actions that would drag the United States into unprecedented conflict with its closest allies. That contradiction is not an accident. It is the result of a movement that defined itself by grievance rather than governance. And this is where the tension tightens, because Mike Johnson knows all of this. He knows a Greenland invasion would be catastrophic politically and strategically. He knows his caucus does not want it. He knows Trump's rhetoric is pulling the party toward a cliff. But he also knows that openly confronting Trump could end his speakership overnight. So he stalls, he hedges, he survives one press conference at a time. That is not strength. It is a countdown. As this story continues to unfold, the question is no longer just what Trump wants or what Johnson says, but how long a party can function when its leaders are improvising under pressure, contradicting each other on matters of war and peace, and hoping the next headline buys them a few more hours. Greenland is the stage, but the drama is about something much larger, the slow, visible unraveling of political authority in the most powerful country on earth. What makes this moment so unsettling is not just what is being said out loud, but what is happening quietly behind the scenes. Because while microphones capture fragments of statements and reporters chase sound bites, the real story is unfolding in the space between power and fear, where instinct replaces strategy and survival replaces leadership. As the Greenland rhetoric intensifies, you can feel the unease spreading through Republican ranks, not because they suddenly discovered a love for international law or alliance politics, but because they understand something fundamental. This issue threatens to expose how hollow their control over government has become inside the Capitol. The mood is not confidence, it is calculation. Every Republican lawmaker is doing math, not ideology. They are counting votes, counting days, counting how many times they can afford to defy Trump before he turns his attention on them. For years, Trump's power came from his ability to punish dissent instantly and publicly. But that weapon only works when fear is absolute. Now cracks are appearing. When members resign, when others openly contradict him, when polling shows erosion, even within the MAGA base, fear starts to lose its edge. And when fear fades, so does obedience. This is why Mike Johnson's reaction to questions about Greenland felt so strained. He was not confused about the issue itself. He was trapped by it. On one hand, Trump and his inner circle are deliberately escalating the language, floating military options, invoking national security threats, and daring allies and lawmakers to push back. On the other hand, Johnson is staring at a caucus that cannot survive a reckless foreign policy gamble. Swing district Republicans know their voters did not send them to Washington to flirt with a NATO crisis. They know donors do not want instability, and they know Democrats are watching closely, ready to frame the midterms as a referendum on chaos. The deeper problem is that Greenland is not an isolated idea. It is part of a broader pattern where territorial ambition is being used as a substitute for political momentum. When domestic narratives fail, external threats become useful tools. This is a familiar playbook in history, and it rarely ends well. Trump's fixation on Greenland, and more recently on places like Venezuela, Panama, and Cuba, reflects an impulse to redefine strength as expansion, as if drawing new lines on a map could compensate for weakening control at home. Senator Chris Murphy's comments resonate precisely because they cut through the noise. He reframed Greenland, not as a joke or a distraction, but as a strategic fault line. His warning about NATO was not hyperbole. NATO is built on trust, on the assumption that disputes between allies will never escalate into force. The moment that assumption collapses, the entire structure becomes meaningless. A United States willing to threaten Greenland is a United States signaling to Europe that alliances are conditional, transactional, and disposable. That message would echo far beyond Europe. China, Russia, and every other geopolitical competitor would immediately recalibrate. The United States would no longer be seen as the anchor of a stable alliance system, but as a volatile actor driven by internal political needs. In that world, deterrence weakens, miscalculation increases, and global instability becomes the norm. These are not abstract concerns. They are the predictable consequences of treating foreign policy as domestic theater. Yet within Trump's circle, the logic is different. Figures like Stephen Miller view confrontation as leverage. They believe pressure creates dominance and dominance creates control. Miller's influence has grown precisely because he thrives in moments of escalation. Where others hesitate, he pushes. Where institutions slow things down, he looks for ways around them. This is why the administration's messaging around military action has become so contradictory. When it suits them, actions are framed as law enforcement. When it suits them, the same actions are framed as military necessity. This ambiguity is not accidental, it is strategic. By blurring definitions, the administration creates space to maneuver without accountability. Trump's argument that certain operations fall outside congressional war powers relies on this confusion, but that argument collapses the moment you apply it to Greenland. There is no legal or rhetorical gymnastics that can transform a military presence in Greenland into anything other than an act of war or at least a hostile military operation. Lawmakers understand this, which is why resistance is building, even among Republicans who have spent years avoiding open confrontation. Marco Rubio's statements add another layer to this tension. As a former senator turned administration figure, Rubio occupies a strange position. He speaks the language of diplomacy while leaving the door wide open to force. His insistence that all options remain on the table is meant to project strength. But in this context, it does the opposite. It signals uncertainty. It suggests a White House that is willing to risk alliances without a clear endgame. This contradiction becomes even more glaring when you consider the administration's stance on Ukraine. The same voices that downplayed the urgency of supporting a country actively resisting Russian aggression now claim Greenland is essential to countering Russia. The inconsistency is not lost on allies or on voters. It reinforces the perception that these arguments are convenient, not sincere. Back in the House, Johnson is watching these contradictions pile up, knowing he will eventually be asked to defend them. His refusal to engage with what he calls GOTA questions is not arrogance. It is fear of being forced to articulate a position that does not exist. There is no unified Republican stance on Greenland. There is Trump's impulse, Miller's aggression, Rubio's hedging, and Johnson's silence. That is not a strategy. It is fragmentation. The numbers make everything worse. With the Republican majority effectively at zero, Johnson cannot afford even symbolic rebellions. One defection on a procedural vote could collapse his speakership. That reality empowers individual members in unprecedented ways. Lawmakers like Thomas Massie, who once would have been sidelined, now hold leverage simply by existing. Every threat to resign, every public disagreement shifts the balance. This is why Johnson's simple statement that the United States is not at war with Greenland matters so much. On its face, it is obvious, but politically, it is a line in the sand. It directly contradicts Trump's willingness to abandon NATO for territorial gain. It signals to nervous members and allies that someone in Republican leadership still recognizes the magnitude of what is being discussed, and yet it stops short of a full rebuke because Johnson cannot afford one. What we are watching is a party caught between impulse and consequence. Trump continues to speak as if power is something he can will into existence through force of personality alone. Johnson, meanwhile, is grappling with the reality that power requires consent, structure, and trust, all of which are eroding. The tension between those two approaches defines this moment. Greenland has become a test not just of foreign policy, but of political maturity. Can a governing party resist the urge to escalate for short-term gain? Can it acknowledge limits without framing them as weakness? So far, the answer appears to be no. Instead, leaders are improvising, hoping controversy distracts from collapse, hoping bold language substitutes for coherent policy. As this standoff continues, the stakes keep rising, allies are watching, markets are listening, voters are forming impressions. Every ambiguous statement, every contradiction chips away at credibility. And in politics, credibility is not something you can reclaim overnight once it is lost. Johnson knows this. That knowledge hangs over every press conference, every evasive answer, every carefully chosen word. Part 2 of this story is not about a decision that has already been made. It is about a narrowing window where hesitation itself becomes dangerous. The longer this rhetoric continues unchecked, the more normal it sounds and the more likely it is to shape reality. That is how democracies drift into crises they never intended to enter. Not through sudden shocks, but through accumulated moments of avoidance, fear, and denial. By the time this story reaches its third act, the tension is no longer subtle. It is structural, baked into the system itself. Because what we are watching now is not just a disagreement over foreign policy, but a slow-motion stress test of American democracy under a leadership style that confuses escalation with strength and visibility with control. The Greenland rhetoric has crossed a threshold where it no longer functions as background noise. It has become a signal both to allies and to domestic audiences that restraint is no longer the default setting of power. At the center of this shift is Donald Trump's instinctive belief that authority is something you project outward, something you impose until others stop resisting. This instinct has always defined his approach, but it becomes far more dangerous when it collides with weakening domestic leverage. Trump is no longer operating from a position of unquestioned dominance within his own coalition. The crowd sizes, the polling data, the defections, the public contradictions all point to a movement that is aging, fracturing, and losing its monopoly on fear. That loss changes behavior. Leaders who feel secure consolidate. Leaders who feel threatened expand. This is where the expansionist logic comes in. Greenland is not unique. It is symbolic. It represents a broader narrative Trump is attempting to construct, one where American decline is reversed not through governance reform or coalition building, but through dramatic assertions of dominance on the world stage. The idea is simple enough to sell in sound bites. America takes what it needs, ignores objections, and forces the world to adapt. The problem is that this vision collides headfirst with reality, particularly the reality of alliances, institutions, and laws that Trump once claimed to oppose, but now finds inconvenient. Behind Trump, the machinery pushing these ideas forward is increasingly concentrated in a small circle of loyalists. Stephen Miller's role in this cannot be overstated. Miller understands that policy details matter less than narrative framing. His strategy has always been to push boundaries until institutions either break or reveal their limits. In the context of Greenland, that means normalizing the idea of military options, repeating the language of strategic necessity, and daring Congress and allies to respond. Each repetition moves the idea one step closer to acceptability, not because it makes sense, but because it becomes familiar. This normalization is how dangerous ideas gain traction. They are not introduced fully formed. They are tested, dismissed, repeated, reframed, and eventually debated as if they were reasonable options. The mere fact that lawmakers and commentators are now seriously discussing congressional authorization for military action in Greenland shows how far the Overton window has shifted. A year ago, this conversation would have been unthinkable. Now it is procedural. Inside Congress, this shift has triggered a quiet but significant response. Lawmakers like Ruben Galgo are moving to reassert congressional authority, not because they expect immediate action, but because they understand the long game. War powers exist precisely to slow down moments like this, to force debate, to create friction where impulse would otherwise dominate. These moves are not dramatic, but they are consequential. They represent an attempt to re-anchor policy and process rather than personality. For Mike Johnson, this institutional pushback is both a lifeline and a threat. On one hand, it gives him cover. He can point to process, to briefings, to constitutional norms, and avoid endorsing Trump's rhetoric outright. On the other hand, it highlights how little independent authority he actually possesses. Johnson is not shaping events. He is reacting to them, trying to stay upright as forces pull him in opposite directions. His speakership survives not on vision, but on balance, and balance is becoming impossible. The psychological toll of this position is evident. Johnson's public demeanor has shifted from confidence to caution, from clarity to ambiguity. Every answer is layered with qualifiers. Every statement is designed to satisfy multiple audiences while committing to none. This is not accidental. It is the behavior of a leader who knows that decisive action in either direction could end his career. Meanwhile, Trump's messaging continues to grow more extreme, not because circumstances demand it, but because escalation is the only tool left that still generates attention.